Eddie is a journalist who wants to expose a millionaire scientist, but somehow ends up fighting against aliens who want to destroy the world. That's why today on the Summarizer, Venom. The movie starts with a satellite falling to Earth, and at the beginning we already have a problem, because in the crash a sample of some kind of rare organism or something like that was lost. But since one of the astronauts is still alive, first they concentrate on saving him. The thing is that he was not quite alive, but this thing had gotten inside him, and at that moment it attacks the doctors and ends up getting into the body of this unfortunate girl. The next day, we see the main character named Eddie waking up with his girlfriend Anne when they plan a date for that night. And there, we are told that apparently this guy is a reporter and is dedicated to unmasking the bad guys. A while later, he arrives at work, greets Richard at the reception, and goes directly to talk to his boss, who gets him an interview with Drake, a millionaire guy who wants to reaffirm that his rockets are safe and the crash was just an accident. Our character doesn't like this very much, but since he has no other choice, he has to do it. That night, he goes out to eat with Anne, where he tells her that he doesn't want to defend people who are not worthy. So she asks him to hold on so he doesn't get kicked out again. But well, later they return home to close the night in the best way.
I understood that reference.
Although in the early morning, Eddie gets up to get some water, and just in time an email arrives to Anne's computer, which is about a lawsuit against the millionaire for the murders of 3 people in a kind of genetic analysis. But well, the next morning we see Drake giving a guided tour for some kids, when he's interrupted by his partner Dora because he has to go change for the interview.
Kids, sorry to leave you. Allie, you're in charge.
And here, instead of asking about the rockets, Eddie accuses him of being a murderer and gets him kicked out of the place. And clearly his boss doesn't like him accusing people without a reliable source, so he ends up firing him. And as if that wasn't enough, his girlfriend also gets fired because of him, so she gives him back his engagement ring and then leaves him.
At least I'm not getting stabbed by some random guy on the street.
The thing is, the poor guy was right, because Drake does hide something pretty shady, and we see that the doctor from the beginning arrives at some kind of carnival where she kills a bunch of people and moves onto the body of a helpless lady. 6 months later, we have the millionaire trying to combine a rather strange organism with a bunny, where they discover that both have to be compatible for the symbiosis to work, which is something like a fusion between 2 organisms. So far so good, but at that moment Drake goes crazy and wants to start testing on humans, and although Dora doesn't want to do it, he threatens her and she has no choice but to accept.
You're a monster!
On the other hand, Eddie goes to a bar to drown his sorrows, but since Drake appears on TV, he prefers to go home. On the way, he crosses paths with a girl who lives on the street called Maria, and takes the opportunity to buy something in a store next door. He gets into an argument with the owner of the store because she recommended him to meditate, and the guy didn't like it very much. But in the middle of the fight, a thief enters and takes all the money from the cash register, although this is not very important. The important thing is that as soon as he gets home, he grabs a couple of beers and starts looking for a job. But since it doesn't work out very well, he decides to give meditation another chance. And that doesn't work out either, because his neighbor just happens to play the guitar. And a while later, it's time for Drake's first test on humans, and since the guy is a bit nervous, he calms him down and convinces him that he's a hero. But it's no use, because as soon as he sees the thing, he goes into crisis, and the poor guy ends up dying in the most painful way possible. That same night, Eddie returns to the store from earlier, but his friend is no longer there. But he doesn't pay much attention to that, because Dora is waiting for him, who explains that her boss is killing people on the street to do his tests. But our character is already very resigned, so he tells her that he can't help her, and for some reason, he thinks of stopping by his ex's house. And it's not such a good idea, because she just arrives with her new partner named Dan, who leaves them alone to talk. There we see that Anne is still angry, even though he misses her and wants to get back together with her. So after the rejection, he thinks things over a bit better and calls Dora, who helps him infiltrate the facility and explains that those weird organisms are aliens and are called symbiotes, or something like that.
What the hell is that?
After this, Eddie enters the lab, where he finds Maria kidnapped in a kind of prison, and in an attempt to help her, he breaks one of the glass panes, but the only thing he gets is that she attacks him and passes that freaky thing to him. Still conscious, he tries to escape, where he discovers that he now has some special abilities. Later, he arrives home a bit shaken and calls Dora to see if she's okay. But then, some pretty weird things start happening to him. The problem is that this thing is no longer in a controlled environment, and on top of that, in the street, it can do whatever it wants. And although right at that moment they manage to get a guy to adapt to the fusion, Drake is still quite worried about his symbiote. Later, Eddie comes to his senses and starts going through the photos among all the mess he made a moment ago, and then he goes to interrupt his ex's dinner because she's the only one he trusts. What happens is that in the middle of all that, he has an attack and ends up scaring everyone.
You are one sick dude.
Then, as Dan is a doctor, he takes him to get an MRI, but in the process, the guy gets some kind of seizures, so he sends him home to rest and tells him to call him when he has more information. And we see that things at the lab aren't going so well either, because the man who managed to adapt to the fusion begins to agonize, and they realize that sounds like the MRI hurt him.
Such poor design. Human beings.
And just at that moment, they discovered Dora, but we'll leave that for later. Meanwhile, Eddie is trying to control whatever is inside him when Anne calls to warn him that he has some kind of parasite, which would explain the vomiting and the voice in his head. The thing is, his neighbor is playing music again, and since it's kind of bad for these creatures, Eddie's going to ask him in the best possible way to turn it down a little.
Whatever. Sure, man. Yeah, I'll just turn right down. Sorry.
Back to Dora, she apologizes to Drake and he kind of understands, but he needs her to tell him who broke into the lab. The thing is, once he finds out who it was, he gets so angry that he ends up leaving her with one of the organisms to take care of her. And at that same time, he sends a group to Eddie's house to capture him. Although it's not going to be so easy because the symbiote takes control, eliminates all the guards that get in his way, and ends up escaping. There, he looks at his reflection and what he sees is not very normal, so he starts to process what is happening to him while talking to the symbiote. But at that moment, Drake finds out that he managed to complete the symbiosis and goes a little crazy, so he needs to capture him as fast as possible. And as they start chasing him with everything they have, Eddie gets on his motorcycle and starts to run. Nothing happens though, because now he has a new friend to protect him from the drones. And in this chase, we see all the new skills of our character, which saves his life more than once, and even ends up exceeding Drake's expectations. They still end up running him over, but just when they are about to capture him, this thing completely takes over his body and manages to escape. Apparently, this organism has the power to regenerate itself, and for the first time, it comes out of Eddie's body and introduces itself as Venom. There he explains that he's going to use it as a vehicle and tells him that he needs his help.
Cooperate, and you might just survive.
On the other hand, we see that the lady from the fair arrives at the airport, and her symbiote shifts into the body of a babe who crosses by. After that, Dan realizes that what happens to Eddie is much worse than he thought, so he asks Anne to take him to the hospital as fast as possible. Later, we have Drake, who doesn't seem too concerned about his partner's death, because what he really cares about is that they let his symbiote die once he killed her. Meanwhile, Eddie tries to go to his old job to give the evidence he gathered to his boss. The thing is that his friend Richard won't let him pass, and as Venom wants to eat him, he prefers to leave. Anyway, nothing happens because now that this thing knows he wants to go up to the building, it helps him without any problems, and they enjoy the view for a while.
Your world is not so ugly. I'm almost sorry to see it end.
After a couple of complications, his friend helps him get into the place, where they have a conversation while Eddie leaves the evidence to the boss, and we see that in the end, these two don't get along as bad as it seems. And once he drops off the information, they get the hell out of there.
Jump.
The elevator thing isn't such a good idea though, because as soon as they get off, they have a few guards waiting for them, so Venom takes the opportunity to have some fun. And while he's getting rid of the threats, Anne shows up and takes him to the hospital. As you can imagine, he's afraid to ride in the same car as her, but since Venom likes her, he's not going to do anything to her. And for some reason, at that moment, this thing becomes a kind of psychologist and helps him with his love issues.
Oh, that's nice.
At the same time, the airport girl arrives at Drake's lab, and there, this other organism takes his chance to get revenge on him. Once they get into the hospital, Dan wants to hospitalize him because according to his studies, he is dying, but Venom gets angry and tries to kill him. Luckily, Anne turns on the MRI machine and leaves it on for so long that it ends up making the thing come out of his body, so they leave it locked in that room.
It's called fucking strategy, alright?
There, Eddie runs off and Dan asks for explanations, but while they're talking, Venom takes the opportunity to escape through the vent and ends up getting inside this little dog. And on top of that, the guards show up at the hospital and kidnap our character. After After this, Drake starts interrogating him and tries to make him feel guilty. And since he now also has a symbiote inside him, he orders to kill Eddie while he works on bringing more of those aliens to the planet. But just before they get rid of him, Venom appears in Anne's body and saves his life. She also ends up returning the parasite to his body, and there he explains that Drake's symbiote is called Riot, which is the strongest of them all and is some kind of leader or something. So they have to go stop him, and even though Anne wants to go, Venom won't let her because it's too dangerous.
Not today.
Oh, that's bullshit!
Then we learn that Venom wants to stop the leader because if they all take over the Earth, he's gonna go back to being a nobody, and he happens to like the life he has on this planet. And we also see Drake preparing for the trip with his new friend, but at that point, he starts killing all the scientists for some reason, and that's when our guys arrive to try to stop him, although it's gonna be a bit complicated.
I mean, what are our chances?
Pretty much zero.
They still have to make the attempt, so a pretty epic fight happens that ends with Riot literally absorbing Venom, but luckily Anne arrives to help them and manages to get the two symbiotes separated from their hosts. So now the fight is between the humans. The thing is, Drake gets his friend back, and this doesn't end in a best way for our character. But just at that moment, his friend arrives to revive him, and when the spaceship is taking off, he manages to damage it, and then on takeoff, he ends up blowing everything to hell. The thing is, even though they get rid of the bad guys, Venom loses his life to protect his host. Finally, Eddie and Anne solve their problems, and both are offered their jobs back, but he's not interested in going back because now he has a much better interview to do. But the important thing is that somehow Venom is still inside him, so they have to set some rules to prevent him from eating anyone. But as the creature is still hungry, they go to the store to buy him something. And luckily for them, at that moment the thief from before arrives, so they give him what he deserves, and at the same time, they take the opportunity to fill his stomach. Oh, and before finishing, we see Eddie going to the famous interview with a serial killer who threatens to kill everyone, but apparently this is left for the next movie. Venom is still alive, and with his friend Eddie will have to stop a serial killer who, on top of dating a girl with superpowers, has another symbiote much more powerful than Venom inside of him. That's why today on the Summarizer, Venom, Let There Be Carnage. The story begins at St. Estes Reform School in California in 1996, where we meet Cletus, a serial killer who's locked up with his girlfriend named Frances. But she has superpowers, and when he asks her what the doctor told her, she says that the mutations and powers are advancing, so she's afraid that they'll take her to another place where there are others like her. And she was right to be afraid, because at that very moment, even though Cletus gets furious, some guards take Frances away. On the way, she attacks the guards with her ability to manipulate sound, but this guy manages to shoot her. After that, she shows up at the hospital and is welcomed to her new home. Back in the present, Frances lives locked up in a mental institution for the criminally insane named Ravencroft, and there some doctors come in to feed her with precautions so she doesn't attack them with her superpower. And it seems every day they give her the newspaper where she follows the news of her boyfriend Cletus, who is imprisoned, and it's not yet known if he will be sentenced to death or not. Meanwhile, our protagonist Eddie Brock is still working as a journalist, and we learn that Cletus wants to talk to him. And as this may help them to know where the rest of the bodies are buried, the detective recommends that he goes. And even though at first Venom wants to eat the detective, Eddie manages to control him in the toilet, and after that he ends up saying he'll go. Later, Eddie goes to visit him in San Quentin prison, and there Cletus says that all he wants is to send a message to his fans, and in exchange for that, he's going to give him his life story. Because he's going to reveal all his secrets, and with that, his career as a journalist is going to be back on top. So Eddie accepts, and Cletus tells him the phrase he wants to get on the front page. That distant cathedral is all I see, fractures angel the other part of me.
What?
And even though we don't understand a damn thing about that phrase, Eddie manages to get it on the front page of the newspaper, and so his girlfriend Frances reads it. Oh, and before leaving, Venom tells Eddie to look at Cletus's drawings on the wall. Our protagonist doesn't understand shit either, and ends up leaving while Cletus tells him not to forget about him. Back at home, Venom starts copying all of Cletus's drawings. There, he draws a couple of things Eddie doesn't understand, but Venom tells him to pay attention. And after looking up a couple of things on the internet, they realize that one of the drawings is where the bodies that were missing were buried. So the police go, find a bunch of bodies, and start interviewing Eddie because he's the only person Cletus talks to. The detective gets angry because the investigation was done by a journalist and not by the police, and they also confirm the death penalty for Cletus. So the two of them are also quite angry too. At night, Venom tells him that they should start going out and catching criminals so he can eat them. He also tells him that he wants to be free and stuff like that. Plus, he's hungry and doesn't want to eat the chickens because they became became his friends. At one point, the relationship is not going to last, and they go to look for food, but Mrs. Chen has no more chocolates. So even though Venom wants to eat human brains, Eddie takes him to eat chickens. At one point, they see a thief, and Venom goes to eat him, but Eddie doesn't let him and ends up throwing him in the trash. After that, his ex-girlfriend Anne calls him, and as Venom misses her, Eddie answers. There she tells him that she needed a little time after everything that happened in the first movie, that if you didn't watch the summary, I'll leave it up here, and finally asks him if they can get together to talk the next night. Eddie says yes, and Venom is thrilled.
It's over with the doctor! That is the voice of a woman who just got brutally dumped!
The next night, he goes to a restaurant, but the talk gets a little awkward.
Awkward.
There they talk about things that no one is interested in, and at one point she tells him that she wanted to meet and talk to him because she's about to get married. Apparently she's getting married to her new boyfriend Dan, and even though Eddie tells her he's happy for her, Venom is sadder than ever.
Yeah, I'm okay. I am not okay.
After that, she finds him weird and asks if Venom is still inside him, but he says no, and that he died at the end of the first movie. Though after a while talking and telling him that he's not ready for commitments, she seems to realize that Venom is still there inside her ex-boyfriend. So she tells Venom to take care of Eddie, and after that, they leave super sad. After that, they ride around on a motorcycle for a while. Venom tells Eddie not to worry and that he's going to help him out of this one. And to relax a little, Venom does what he does best. He cooks for Eddie.
Catch up!
At one point, he grabs the mail and receives a letter from Cletus. There he tells him that he invites him to witness his execution and his last moments on Earth. He also tells him that he's responsible for causing the end of Cletus and that they're going to stop his heart like when he was born. But if he hadn't been revived that time, he'd have never killed his grandmother, his mother, and his dog. And so he'd never have been beaten by his father and sent to reform school where he met his girlfriend. So the next day, Eddie and Venom go to jail to visit Cletus. Eddie records the interview, and Cletus talks to him about the consequences of the things that we do. He also tells him that the two of them are the same and that they are both family. Before he dies, he asks him if he wants anything, and the bad guy wishes him to live alone for the rest of his life just like him. There he starts telling him things to make Venom angry, until he finally gets the symbiote to attack him and Cletus bites him. And there he realizes that Eddie has something inside that isn't blood. After that, Eddie and Venom get into an argument. Venom tells him that everything he achieved is thanks to him, but there they end up fighting and Venom wants to kick him out of the house by throwing all his stuff.
How dare you!
In the end, Venom ends up leaving, enters the body of another man who is in the street, and finally Eddie is free. But he starts to hear noises and sees that Venom broke his whole motorcycle. And finally also Venom passes into the body of a woman riding a bike. The next day is the death sentence of Cletus. He says his last words, and finally he's injected with the lethal dose. But something strange starts to happen. Carnage appears and kills the first cop. And after that he goes to look for the mayor, killing a lot of people who are just working. And after that, finally, Cletus escapes with his new symbiote named Carnage inside. The next day, Eddie already enjoys his life without Venom. He starts to fix his apartment, frees the chickens, and meanwhile, Venom walks around the city quietly. At night, Eddie sees on TV that the serial killer Cletus escaped, and then the detective appears and starts to doubt Eddie, but he tells him that he doesn't know anything, and in the end, the detective doesn't tell him anything and leaves. After that, Eddie starts listening to the recording of the last time he saw Cletus, but he doesn't understand a thing. Meanwhile, Venom keeps looking for a compatible body, so along the way, this guy dies too. He then moves on to the body of another man who luckily was at a costume party, so Venom gets unnoticed and everyone loves the costume. And meanwhile, Cletus and Carnage killed another person. After that, Cletus steals a car, gets talking to his symbiote, and since Carnage wants to kill Venom and Cletus wants to find his girlfriend, they decide to help each other. And on the way, for no reason, they throw a van over the bridge, so I guess they killed at least one person there. At the same time, Eddie keeps keeps investigating and goes to the reform school of the beginning. There he calls a detective because he found the initials of the couple on a tree. He asks him if he knows a woman with the initials FB, and he tells him her name, but he also says that he was the one who killed her many years ago. Later, Cletus kills another guy. He surfs the web, and there he discovers that Frances is alive, and meanwhile she's still locked up in her cell while the doctor tells her that her boyfriend escaped, but he'll never be able to find her in that place. Well, maybe he will.
Ta-da!
There, Cletus introduces her to Carnage, and together they smash the cell and escape. Oh, and while escaping, they kill 6 guards. After that, they escape in the car until at one point, Carnage starts attacking the cops, and the truth is, I don't think any of the cops that were inside died. The ones who die for sure are the 4 that were inside the helicopter when Frances uses her superpower. The problem is that Carnage is sensitive to sound, and so he tells her not to do it anymore, so the next helicopter is handled by him. After that, Venom arrives, almost dying, asking the Chinese woman for chocolate, so I guess the guy who wasn't compatible also died. After all this, the detective asks Eddie why strange things always happen around him, and at one point he says that the rest of the patients in the hospital said they saw a monster. So Eddie realizes that Cletus bit his hand that time and starts to understand everything. So he calls his ex-girlfriend, tells her that the serial killer also has an alien inside, and so now everyone has to find Venom. After that, she goes to look for him at the Chinese market and realizes that Venom is inside Mrs. Chen. So she ends up convincing him, and together they go to find Eddie. Meanwhile, Cletus sets on fire the reform school, and now they go to look for the detective who took Frances's eye, Venom, and Eddie. After that, she enters with Venom and takes him out of the police station. On the way, Venom and Eddie reconcile and they're friends again. The detectives cross paths with Carnage and Eddie, and they kidnap him to take him to Frances. Then she enters Eddie's apartment and sees Anne's picture with the engagement ring, so now they go looking for her too. After a while, she finds them, incapacitates her boyfriend, and tells him that Cletus wants to trade Eddie's head for hers, so she kidnaps her too. After that, Dan calls Eddie, tells him they kidnapped Anne and are going to the wedding. And if you're wondering what fucking wedding, I mean the one between Cletus and Frances, because they kidnapped a priest and now they want to get married? I don't know. The point is that at one point, Eddie shows up with Venom, and it looks like he's gonna start fighting, but Venom is a little scared because Carnage is too powerful.
Let's go. No. Congratulations to the happy couple. We are leaving.
Anyway, in the end, Eddie convinces Venom, and it starts what we all expected, an endless fight between computer-created monsters. At one point, Frances is gonna kill the detective, but Carnage interrupts her to tell her to stop screaming. Oh, and he also takes the opportunity to eat the priest for no reason at all. Meanwhile, the detective escapes, Frances goes to look for him, and all our protagonists continue to fight. In the middle of the battle, we learn that Cletus hates Eddie because as a journalist, he never explained the reason for his evil, and neither he talked about when he was a boy and was abused by his family. Anyway, this doesn't matter much. What matters is the final fight between monsters and humans. After killing Carnage, Cletus's end comes, who before dying says that all he wanted was his friendship.
Fuck this guy.
After that, Anne leaves with her boyfriend, and the police arrive at the place, I don't know to do what, because they're all dead. Well, not all of them, because apparently the detective...
Monsters.
He's alive!
Finally, Eddie and Venom are still friends on the run, and they go on vacation to a beach as Venom had asked. And the two of them are happy on a beach.
But wait! There's more!
Of course there's more, because in the post-credits scene, we see Eddie watching TV. There, Venom says that everyone has a hidden past, and he has 80 billion light years of knowledge, or something like that. The point is that there, he gives him a taste of the things that the symbiotes experienced. But right at that moment, something weird happens, and they're teleported to another place. Venom says he didn't do anything, and apparently this was all because of what Doctor Strange did, and now they're in Spider-Man's universe. That was Venom Let There Be Carnage. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and comment which movies or series you'd like me to summarize and make a kill count. See you later.
Go to work.
Okay. Bye.